Okay, so if this works, you are now looking at the title slide, which says Remote Class Number 1. Okie doke. So I've got a stopwatch here that I'm going to be using just to see if we don't, to make sure that we don't go over the time that Lee has suggested. So there we go. Now, we're going to talk a bit in this class about agriculture, and I see that I've got, I just got to move this a little bit back so we get the whole screen here. There we go. Is that working? Yeah. Yeah, it seems to work, so you have the whole screen itself. You don't quite have, yeah, I think that's going to work. Okay, so when we talk about California agriculture, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the sessions last September, you have to remember that land distribution in California in the 19th century, and it continued to affect the way in which land was distributed in the state in the 20th century, was very different from the rest of the U.S. This particular image in front of you symbolizes the way in which land was distributed in the United States during westward expansion. And westward expansion means basically from the Allegheny, from the Atlantic Ocean up to about the Mississippi River. It was done in family groups. And when the families got there to wherever they were going, what they tried to do is they started family farms. And a lot of the land was divided up, beginning with the Northwest Ordinance and then continuing basically through the entire Civil War era, pre-Civil War era. It was divided up into townships with 36 square miles, and one of those townships was one of those plots was for school and another for government buildings and stuff like that. But basically, the most of the townships were given to family farms, and the public domain of the United States, which was the general term that was used to describe land way out there in the West, which wasn't yet divided into territories and then into states, was basically settled by family farms. And any kind of old time Western that you may have seen, you have the family farm, and you have mommy and daddy and the kids, and they're all working together. The ideal was that you wanted to have a farm far enough away from everybody else so that you couldn't hear your neighbor's dog bark, that kind of thing. But basically it was a family farm orientation. Well, in California, which before 1848, when it became part of the United States, we always have to remember that California was not part of North America in the way that we understand North America, British North America. California was part of Latin America. And the land distribution there was different because the major institution in the lands of California was the mission. This is a picture of Mission Carmel in the 1760s, and you get a little sense of what it was like. But basically everything that you could see in that picture, the chapel buildings, which is right about there. I should get a better pointer. The chapel building right about there, and the other buildings out here, which were Indian housing, and the land all around it. All of that stuff was part of the mission. I told my students, if you could go up to Swig Hall, top of Swig Hall, that 11-story dorm that we have, and look out, and basically, except for the city of San Jose, virtually everything that you could see was part of Mission Santa Clara lands. The missions were extensive land holdings. And when the mission period ended, what happened was that you got the mission lands divided up into large ranchos. And this particular map here is a map of Santa Clara County with those ranchos, and you can see some of the names, which are very, very familiar to us. You can see, for example, Gilroy down there, Rancho Yerba Buena, Rancho, the Pueblo, that's the San Jose Pueblo, and there's Mission Santa Clara. All of these ranchos that were basically given to the sons of people who were military people, their sons, the second generation. They basically were extensive ranchos because what they grew was not so much food. What they grew was cattle. And that was a very profitable thing. So cattle, as you know, have to range so that they can graze and stuff like that. And so on all of these ranchos, all of the cattle were branded with the brand of the particular rancho, and they kind of mingled around. And then there was roundup time, and the cattle were got together and they were slaughtered. This is a similar map that you can get from Los Angeles, and you can see some of the names here. For example, right down there, Sasal Redondo. That's where Redondo Beach is. Up here, you have San Pascual. You have Azusa. You have a bunch of all of these ranchos were basically cattle ranches. So the fact that what they grew, quote unquote, in these Spanish missions and then the Mexican ranchos was cattle meant that the land holdings, even after the mission lands got divided up, the land holdings were still fairly significant. So that was one thing that was different, the size of the land holding. Another thing, this is a view of the roundup, and this is near San Francisco in Upper California. This is from a book that was published in 1839, the first history of California written in English, and there you have the cattle steer being lassoed there. But from this picture, which was done by an American serviceman who came to the Monterey area during the Mexican War, you can see. What these people are doing is they are stirring the tallow, the cattle fat. The cattle had two products which people wanted. There was the hides, the leather, which was turned into leather, and largely exported to the eastern coast of the United States, where it became the raw material for the burgeoning shoe industry. And the second was the cattle fat, the tallow, and that was used for a couple of things. It was used to make candles, and it was used to make soap. And the excess that was not used at the missions was often exported to Hawaii. But you can see the people who were doing this, these are obviously indigenous people, they're Indians. And most of the work that was done on the mission lands and also on the rancho lands after the mission system was abolished in the 1830s was done by indigenous people. And that's kind of the second difference in agriculture between California and the eastern part of the United States. The second distance was that the lands were worked by people who were from a different ethnic group from the people who owned the lands. And so you had two differences. You had the lands being larger, and you had the ranch hands. The ranch hands being from a different ethnic group. And that persisted in California, as you can see from this next picture. This is the workforce at Riverside, the citrus workforce. And you can see that they are largely Chinese, and some of them are Mexicans. And, again, the fruit picking and that kind of thing, the tending of the ranches continued to be done in California by a different ethnic group than from the people who own the land. And this is especially the case after, when the citrus industry really took off in Southern California in the 1880s after the invention of the refrigerator car. To make this citrus stuff profitable, you had to have a large quantity of harvests. And so what happens is that, even though some of the stuff may have started with individual families, they had to combine, and they had to combine very early. And so you get big conglomerates like Del Monte, which kind of grew up in the latter part of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. But the people who picked the crops, the people who tended the produce, it continued to be the same way as it was during the Spanish and Mexican era. They were a different ethnic group, and there you have Santa Anna in 1900. And once again, by this time you had Chinese exclusion, but these people tended to be Southern European, Southern Indians, Southern Asians, people from India and what's now Pakistan. They also tended to be increasing numbers of Japanese, and they also continue to be Mexicans. So that's an important thing. That the California agricultural experience from the beginning and persisting into the 20th century tended to be different in that the lands tended to be larger, and the workers tended to be of a different ethnic group.